let's move on to our next slide. So I've already told you that I have been an ESL teacher for a very long time, for the last 13 years. I am also the co-editor for Intercom, which is TESOL International's newsletter for intercultural communication interest section. I became really interested in intercultural communication because I was coordinating a program between teacher education at the University of Dayton and international students at the University of Dayton. So I thought, well, if I'm going to be bringing these people together, I want to know, like, are there best practices for doing that? And that really brought me to all the research that's been done on intercultural communication and competence. It was really surprising to me how much people have researched in this specific field. I have a journal article that is coming out very soon in Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning. It's a co-authored article with a couple education professors at the University of Dayton. A very big deal. We spent a lot of time on it, and I'm so happy that it's finally going to be available soon. So if you're interested in reading about that, you can do so. All right, so I'm going to leave this slide up for just a couple minutes. If you want to get that Q code, it will take you directly to the Google folder. And that Google folder has this presentation and a few other documents, information about how to get published in TESOL. I do a lot of volunteering for TESOL International, and I really want to encourage you to publish, to share your work, share your ideas with the TESOL community. You are already good enough. Don't think that someone else has something better to say than you. Please do reach out and see how you can get involved in publishing in TESOL International. I have resources in that Google folder. I'm also on LinkedIn if you'd like to connect with me. And I have my own YouTube channel for professional development and videos for ESL, specifically for students. So if you want to take a look and borrow some of my materials, if they meet your needs, that is totally fine with me. Okay. Oh, sorry. Hi. Ha ha ha. That's not good. Okay, slow down. There we go. Here we go. All right, so my intended audience for this session is primarily K through all the way through university, educators who want to develop their students' intercultural competence. My purpose for this presentation is just to raise your awareness of theories that of intercultural communication and competence as they relate to teacher practice. In the chat, if you can take a moment and just share some information about who you are, what teaching context you're coming from. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that so we can kind of see who's in the room. I always like to find out how people get interested in TESOL because some people have very, very interesting stories. My colleague that I used to work with at University of Dayton got interested in teaching TESOL when she was traveling around West Africa. She met a guy in a truck. She was hitchhiking and she asked what he was doing and he was like, "Oh, I teach English." And so that's how she got interested in teaching English. I thought that was a really funny story. She ended up marrying that guy too, so you never know. Anyone have any information about your teaching context? Where do you teach? What ages? Do you teach in private school or public school? Do you teach in university? So I see some questions about TESOL. So TESOL International is the professional organization, international organization for teachers of English to speakers of other languages. There's a membership fee, but there's a lot of things that you can do if you're not a member. You can go to TESOL.org. I'll put that in the chat, TESOL.org. And you can find out about that professional organization just by kind of seeing the things that they offer. I said before that I was a newsletter editor for an interest section. If you're a member of TESOL, you can join these groups of interests, and you can become part of their community, have access to their newsletters, be part of their webinars. So those are some of the benefits of joining TESOL. And also just giving back, because as I said before, you are already an expert. You already are an expert with your particular context, and sharing your ideas is really useful for the TESOL community. Okay. Okay, great. So a lot of my background is in higher education. I have since 2006 to 2019. I've been teaching young adults. I would say 18 to 26 years old. A lot of Saudi students, a lot of Chinese students, some Japanese students, Korean, Libya. We had a lot of Libyan students. Brazilian students, and lots of other little countries. Not little, but when in my mind, I'm thinking of population-wise, basically all over the world. But our major populations were Chinese and Saudi Arabian, as well as some Japanese. Okay, all right. So let's go ahead and move on. So for this particular session, I'm going to relate and differentiate culture from identity, because I think that those terms get confused or used interchangeably. I'm also going to describe, relate, and connect theories of intercultural competence, development, and communication with practical experiences and real-world scenarios. We'll explore the complexity of culture in an age of global migration and globalization. I'm sure you have experiences in this too. It's no longer a world where culture and identity so completely align, because people are moving around. We'll look at some simple tips for improving intercultural communication, and I'll also talk about how to create a class environment where all students feel that they belong. All right. Okay, great. So I am seeing a lot of K-12 students and some higher ed. That's great. All right, so here's our little game that I have. I have 6 statements here. And in the chat, I would like you to tell me which 3 of these statements you think are not true. So take a minute and type the numbers of the statements that you think are not true. Any thoughts? Statements that are not true. So in the chat, type the number of the statements that you think are not true. Okay, so we're seeing. So a lot of people think 5 and 6 are probably not correct. What I always find very funny is that in the United States, when I do professional development and presentations about intercultural competence, I will have people who think that 6 is true. And these are usually my American English speakers that have not traveled anywhere else. They'll be like, well, I'm just normal. I'm just regular. I don't have culture. And I'm like, that says a lot about what you understand about culture. They just think that they're normal. Okay, so I see a lot of people are definitely seeing that 5 and 6 have some complications, may not be true. So as we go through the rest of these slides, we'll talk about each of these statements and see if they are true or false. I did notice that a number of people think that 1 may be false. So let's keep that in mind as we go along. All right, so let's talk about some terms and background knowledge to help us understand what we're talking about. Perhaps you have seen this. If not, I'll explain it to you. This is Kachru's 3 circles of English. I can get to my notes here. So to help us better understand intercultural competence in today's world, it's helpful to take a step back and examine the role of English as an international language. So learning English in today's world is different than learning English in the past. In the past, a primary goal of learning English was to be able to communicate with native English speakers. However, today, learning English allows people to communicate with more than native English speakers. And that's what we see in Kachru's 3 circles of English. This diagram is helpful and useful in helping us understand the differences in how English is learned and used. So our inner circle, these are the countries like USA, UK, Australia, Ireland, places where we don't have a colonial past, and English is often learned as the first language of the people who live there. The outer circle are places that have a colonial history with English. And a lot of these people also now are growing up speaking English natively, which Americans are like, oh no, but they don't. And I'm like, no, they so do. And it's a different variety of English. And so we have people in the outer circle who have learned English their whole lives. And then we have people in the expanding circle for whom English may not be a first language. In fact, for a lot of them, it's not. It's learned as a foreign language. It's not an official language. So learning English now helps people from countries in the expanding circle talk to people in countries from the outer circle. Maybe native speakers aren't involved at all. And in fact, most of the communication in English that's being done around the world is not involving any native speakers of English. And so that's the new reality of the use of English as a tool for people around the world. So what I want us to understand from these circles is that when we tie together learning English and developing intercultural competence, we really need to be mindful that the goal of learning English shouldn't solely be to communicate with native English speakers. Instead, the goal really has to be to communicate with other speakers of English, no matter which circle of English they're coming from. Right. All right. So intercultural competence, if people you're talking to want to know why we need to know about intercultural competence, it's for jobs. That's usually the first thing that people say is, oh, help me, get a better job or earn more money. But it's also for international relationships. There are a lot of wide-scale problems that we face together as people on this planet that require nations to work together. Climate change is probably the biggest one. I was reading in National Geographic several months ago that the polar ice caps the North Pole will no longer be the North Pole in 2036, I think is what the estimates are, is there will no longer be ice. It will all be open ocean. And you have made, countries, USA, China, Russia, I think Denmark too, up in the North Pole, all kind of trying to stake their claims to the North Pole. So this is a very interesting world that we are living in, and intercultural competence is for everyone. It's for scientific progress, but it's also for cultivating peace. Too often lately, this has been happening. I mean, even today, we have people who are resorting to extreme forces rather than diplomacy and talking and trying to find common ground. And that's why this topic is so important. And don't underestimate the importance that you play in your students' development of their intercultural competence. Your position as their teacher is so very important to the health of this world. And we talked about that too. Yeah, and global migration. As climate change affects people and as more hostilities continue to happen between countries, people will be displaced. And we need more intercultural competence for everyone to make this a more peaceful world to live in. So here's a question for you. What characteristics do you think an interculturally competent person has? So adjectives that you can think of that describe an interculturally competent person. What do you think? Go ahead and type your ideas into the chat box. When you think of an interculturally competent person, what do they look like? How do they act? What behaviors do they have? Open-minded? Mm-hmm. Other thoughts about what interculturally competent people have? Characteristics. Mm-hmm. Openness. Respectful. Oh, that's such a nice word, resilient. I love that word. Resiliency, meaning they can continue after failing or after being embarrassed, that they keep trying. Tolerant. Okay. Excellent. And later in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about what some of those characteristics are in terms of what the research shows. There's actually been a good deal of research about this topic, and I have some information to share with you about that. Oh, that's so perfect. Curious. Yes, yes, I love it. Curious is absolutely vital. All right. So how do people develop intercultural competence? Surprisingly, the first thing is that you need to know yourself. What is your identity? What is your culture? Intercultural competence is a lot about practicing mindfulness of yourself, the situation that you're in, and the person that you're speaking with. And this is what's really hard sometimes for people to understand, is that when you are talking to someone, anyone, it doesn't have to be, someone from another culture, but anyone that you talk to, the person that you're talking to is the person that you imagine the other person to be. So what I'm saying is, when you meet someone for the first time, you have expectations and ideas about what that person is going to be like. And as you interact with that person, sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. And you have to be, and being mindful of that, knowing that how you see someone can be proven wrong later, is so important in developing intercultural competence. And that's a skill that you can develop with your students in a number of ways. Just helping them understand that when you see someone and talk with someone, you have to be open to accepting the person however they are, in whatever form they come, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if you don't understand. That's a huge part of being interculturally competent. Whoops, there I go again. Sorry about that. Okay. Right. All right, so culture is experienced socially. Culture shapes our beliefs, our values, and our norms. Culture is the set of rules that everyone in a community follows. You don't necessarily, not that everyone follows, but everyone knows, because some people choose to not follow the rules. Some people bend the rules, some people break the rules, but everyone knows what the rules are when they belong to a culture. I love to use that description to help people understand what culture is. Culture can feel invisible to those who share the same culture with the people around them. So if you're talking with people who have never been outside of their community and don't talk to anyone who comes from different cultural backgrounds, it can feel like culture doesn't exist. And this was the biggest challenge I had in working with American teacher education students, was helping them understand that they did have a culture, and it was most definitely shaping their teaching. It was very, very challenging. So the things that are filling this cup right now, they're all aspects of our identity. The way I like to understand our identity is that it has many layers that mesh together to create who we are. Culture is created between people. It's socially constructed. We can, like I said, we can follow rules, we can break the rules, we can rebel against those rules, but we all know what those rules are. When we enter another culture, and we aren't familiar with the rules, the values, or the beliefs, we become disoriented, and that leads to culture shock. Identity, on the other hand, is experienced internally and individually, and we express it to others. So that's kind of an overview of the difference between those two terms. So my definition for intercultural competence, I'm taking from Deardorff. If you don't take away anything else, I hope that you take away from this session that being interculturally competent means that you are aware of the rules that govern how you see the world and how you behave, and understanding that others might be following different rules. That really is the biggest lesson about intercultural competence. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've been everywhere in the world and you know all these different cultures and languages. It's having awareness that the way that you see the world and behave is follows a certain cultural perspective. Darla Deardorff's definition of intercultural competence is one of the most widely used definitions. And she says that it's the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in intercultural situations based on one's intercultural knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And I think it's a great definition because it really helps us understand that being interculturally competent is not just about language. In fact, language is never mentioned in this, is it? It doesn't say knowing a lot of languages. Okay. All right, so let's get to our 3 myths about intercultural competence. The first one is that some people don't have culture, aka I am just normal. The truth is that sometimes we are blind to our cultural lens. If we're surrounded by people that have the same background as us, then we may not see our cultural lens. So here's a little activity for us to do. In the chat, I would like you to type the number of the picture or pictures that you think Adobe stock tagged with the word culture. So in other words, these pictures are curated by Adobe, the software company. And when you search for an image, you have to use a search term. So when I went to Adobe stock footage and put in the word culture, which of these pictures do you think I saw? Put your ideas into the chat. So I went into Adobe stock and I searched for for images that represent the word culture. Which images do you think Adobe stock gave me when I was looking for culture? Okay, so we got some ideas. I see people are saying 9, 7, 10, 3, 3, 4. Interesting. 4, 7, 9, 10. 8, 9, 10, 9, 5. All of them. Well, yes, it's true. All of them actually should represent culture, but not according to Adobe. And I find this to be an interesting activity because it really says what Adobe who Adobe thinks its users are. I kind of wonder if I were using Adobe in another country, if the results would be different. I'm not sure. But here are the images. I'll type them in the chat, the numbers. So the numbers that came up as culture were 2, 7, 10, 6, 3. So Adobe decided that 2, 7, 10, 6, and 3 represented culture. The other ones, the one which is a candied apple, something that Americans like to eat around fall, the time autumn. 9 is a Thanksgiving dinner. 5 is the 4th of July celebration in the United States, which, you know, again, it is cultural, but it wasn't tagged with culture in Adobe stock images. 4 is American football, obviously cultural, and so is that handshake in 8. So sometimes we can be blind to our own culture. All right, let me catch up with my notes. So to understand this cultural blindness, I'm going to turn to Ting Toomey and Chung, who envision the development of intercultural competence in terms of increasing awareness and awakening to the existence of cultural competence. So they start with unconscious incompetence. You don't know that you're interculturally incompetent. That's a stage, just to not even know that you're interculturally incompetent. And then from there is conscious incompetence. In other words, you are aware that you're interculturally incompetent. And that's not a very comfortable position to be in. Some people cannot stand that, and they just prefer to not engage. And then there's conscious competence. You're aware that you're interculturally competent. And so a lot of work that I've seen my students do, my international students at American universities, they're in those yellow and green stages. A lot of them are in that yellow stage where they're trying to learn the rules. They understand that they don't know the rules, and they're trying to learn them. And one of the participants mentioned resiliency. This is why resiliency is so important. People who are not resilient may not make much progress in intercultural competence, because it requires that you're able to make mistakes and learn how to repair those mistakes, how to get up, how to keep going. And that's where a lot of that work is done. And then finally, unconscious competence is you don't know that you're interculturally competent. And these would be the people who are bicultural, bilingual, where they don't have to think about how do I behave well in this other culture. And it's possible to be aware of how to engage in 2 cultures, but not others, right? So even if you're culturally competent across, 2 cultures, that doesn't mean you're great at talking with people from another culture. So developing intercultural competence is really an ongoing process. All right, so having intercultural competence means you know a lot about other cultures. That's our second myth. I'm afraid about going to this link. I don't know if I can. I'm not even going to try it because I don't want to mess up our live feed. But you are free to go to that after the session if you'd like to. It just shows you a map of how people are moving around the world, and I'll summarize it here for you. So this graph shows us global migration patterns, and We see that North America and Europe are still areas of the world that are attracting the most immigrants. But I think the greater takeaway here is that people are moving all over the world, and not always from, from Africa or Middle East to North America or Europe. We have a lot of people moving within Asia, a lot of people moving within Africa. So people are really on the move. And a lot of them are using English as an international language. With so many different people migrating to new lands, intercultural competence is becoming vitally important to all domains of social and political life. And at the same time, it's important to understand that to be interculturally competent doesn't mean that you know about all of these cultures and all of these languages. Instead, intercultural competence relies heavily on the ability of people to use appropriate skills and strategies for intercultural communication, and that helps them develop their cultural knowledge. Okay. So if you take nothing else away from this session, I hope that one of your key takeaways is that nation doesn't necessarily equal culture. In this age of global migration, these are actual cultural experiences that people have. What is the experience of a French adult whose parents were Algerian immigrants? What's the experience of a Syrian refugee who's growing up in Germany now? Or an Italian parent who's an Italian adult whose parents immigrated from Japan? Or what about Indian parents who are trying to build a life for their children in the UAE? Or even British children whose grandparents immigrated from Pakistan, right? So these are all new understandings of what culture is. Nation doesn't necessarily equal culture. I mean, there are cultures that don't have nations. The Rohingya Muslims are still looking for a place to live. It's really difficult and, difficult to say the least experience that they're having. All right. So still about this myth too. Because of shifting global migration patterns, it's not so uncommon to have a student who could be represented like this. So, Brazilian citizen, current American resident, child of Japanese father. This was a student I had in 2008. Or, you could have a student that looks like this. And these people are not unusual anymore. This is becoming very, very common. So national borders and the idea of national cultures is being redefined. As societies become more and more globalized, it's becoming necessary to have a new way to understand cultural interactions. And that is what hybrid theory does. Hybrid theory, first theorized by Babha and most recently by Adrian Holiday. This theory contextualizes the idea of culture in a modern world where global migration is increasing. And if you don't understand this, just go back and think about what I was saying about identity, the fact that identity is multifaceted. When we connect those two ideas, we see that hybridity is how we all are. And it might be possible that in an intercultural exchange, we find that we have more in common with someone from another culture than we have with members of the culture that we grew up with. Hybrid theory encourages people in intercultural interactions to seek ways to be new selves in new domains. And I think that this can be very empowering for English learners who may feel that they don't completely belong to one culture or another. So if you can encourage this kind of concept of a third culture in your classroom, you can create this middle group where all cultural spheres that a student belongs to are valued. And we'll talk more in a later slide about multilingual classroom concerns. Okay. So as we're starting to see, intercultural competence is less about how much you've traveled and how many languages you speak. Instead, it's more about these kinds of things. It's increasingly, what hybrid theory teaches us is that it's increasingly useful to enter intercultural experiences with the perspective that the people that we're talking to from other cultures likely share some common experiences and perhaps even values and beliefs. In a global world, 3 people from 3 different countries may all enjoy the same singer, or maybe they've all experienced international moves, or perhaps they have all experienced something like shaming their parents for not passing a class. And so that's how intercultural competence can be seen. It's more about how cognitively flexible and resilient you are. Can you imagine other perspectives? Can you engage with other people respectfully? Can you actively listen? Can you be curious? Can you persevere after failure and embarrassment? Because if you do intercultural communication, you are going to be embarrassed. You're going to make mistakes. I've done them. I studied, like I said, I studied French for a very long time, 8 years. And when I went to when I went to France for the first time, I still couldn't communicate with the little kids sitting with me on the train. And I felt like a child. And it was awful. And I would ask for things at a restaurant and people wouldn't understand me. People, you know, and I guess it's funny. Oh, American trying to speak French. Why doesn't she just speak English because we know English? But, you know, that can be embarrassing to feel like you've put so much time and effort into learning English and not be able to have people communicate with you. Oh, I see one question. What does hybridity mean? Hybridity is kind of talking about understanding overlap, how 2 different things come together. And so we don't have category 1 and category 2. Maybe we have those categories move together like in a Venn diagram and we have overlap between them. So hybridity is like a little bit of both. So when we're talking about cultures, cultural hybridity is referring to the fact that you can have a bi or tri-cultural, multicultural experience. Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say, that you can have experiences from multiple cultures and that influences your identity. Okay, moving on. So here are those characteristics of an interculturally competent person that I mentioned before. Bukowski and Phillips just last year published a really great book and she narrowed down some very easy to understand characteristics. So these people recognize that many concepts that we take for granted are culturally based. Things like time, friendship, gender, how to dress, politeness. A lot of these concepts are culturally based and they lead to expectations and restraints. Many actions or language acts are culturally based. They understand that. They question their own responses before jumping to conclusions about other people's intentions. That's really hard. It's not human nature to slow down and question. We want to immediately judge and immediately know and move on because life's too short, right? But it takes training and that's something that you can do with your students, or activities that encourage them to slow down and critically examine why they are having these reactions, why they have the emotions that they're experiencing, why they want to take certain actions. Interculturally competent people have a set of skills and strategies to maintain emotions that arise from experiencing difference and ambiguity. When we experience difference and we don't have definite answers, we can feel anxiety. We can focus, and instead we need to be focusing on meaning and humanity, understanding that most people in the world, are good people and don't want to hurt you. And just because someone's different than you doesn't mean they're bad or that they're out to hurt you. Interculturally competent people also can engage in intercultural dialogue by demonstrating competence in listening and being willing to hear other perspectives. They can non-defensively appreciate other people's accomplishments. They can disagree appropriately. They can resolve conflicts, okay, looking for that common ground. All right. Finally, our third myth is that intercultural competence can be measured by taking a test. The funny thing here is that there are tons of tests to measure your intercultural competence, but they're not going to give you a result that says, oh, you're interculturally competent. It's going to give you a reference point, so you have a guide to understand what you can do to continue to improve. One of the most widely accepted models of intercultural competence development comes from Milton Bennett. This is his developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. When you take this test, you are placed in one of these stages of intercultural sensitivity. I'm not going to talk too much about this. If this is interesting to you, you can look it up and read about it later. Basically, what it's showing you is that people can be in denial that other cultures exist, all the way to the other end where people actively integrate another culture in with their own understanding of the world. Research that I found in terms of American teacher education, American teachers' intercultural competence. There was a 2006 study. It's kind of old at this point, but I haven't seen one that's come out lately. A lot of American teachers end up being in minimization. And these are Midwestern K through 12 teachers. So even teachers who have gone to school for, learning how to teach their students effectively, a lot of them are within minimization, where they say, oh, well, minimization is like, well, we're all pretty much the same, so it's not important for me to learn about what makes you culturally different. And if you understand intercultural competence, you can see how that can be damaging to not understand cultural differences with your learners. Really doesn't integrate them into your classroom. It gives you the freedom to say, well, if you're not doing well, it's not my fault, because my instruction is good and you just come from another culture. And so it's not really, we want teachers to be beyond minimization. We want them to understand that culture matters, and it's important that we know what our culture is, and it's important that we not only respect and tolerate, but also that we seek to understand the cultures that our students are coming from. All right, and finally, our 3 truths about intercultural competence. It is becoming a leading soft skill for workplaces. All about soft skills right now and employability. For as much work that has been done on getting students ready for, having students have strong science and math and engineering skills, now employers are asking for soft skills like communication, problem solving, cognitive flexibility, emotional intelligence, interpersonal skills, and teamwork. And if you've been here with me this whole time, you've seen that intercultural competence touches on all of those areas. So if you need an argument for why you're teaching intercultural competence to your students, this is a big one. You can say that this is going to strengthen those soft skills that they need for future employment. Okay, our second truth is that 3 attitudes that are essential to developing intercultural competence are respect, openness, and curiosity. And this has been borne out in the research. I mentioned just briefly that TESOL International's action agenda for the future of the TESOL profession talks specifically about recognizing multilingualism as an asset. Being a multilingual learner should not be seen as a negative thing. It should be seen as an asset that positively influences language outcomes. And that is leading me into the Deardorff's process model for developing intercultural competence. So an overview of what you're looking at here. This is an ongoing process that starts with having the right attitudes. Deardorff recognizes respect, openness, and curiosity as being the 3 key attitudes that you need to develop intercultural competence. From there, when we interact with people, we are developing our cultural knowledge. We're having a deepening understanding of our cultural self-awareness. We are learning more about socio-linguistic awareness, and we're practicing our skills of listening, observing, evaluating, analyzing, interpreting, and relating. And in those interactions, if we take a moment to reflect, we can inform our frame of reference. We can shift how we see things, how we understand what we experience, but it involves reflection. Reflection is such a critical component of developing intercultural competence, because if all you do is have good attitudes, participate in communication, and you never think about what you did, you're not developing that self-awareness that you need to understand when miscommunications happen. And then finally, when you have a frame of reference shift, then you can have more effective and more appropriate behavior in intercultural situations. For those of you who are teaching in multilingual classrooms, I'd like to point out Allport's contact theory gives us some great ideas about how to structure assignments and projects, group work that brings students together. So Allport in his research finds 4 different conditions that are needed to reduce prejudice and intergroup conflict. And this isn't just for education. I mean, this is just for working together with other people. If you're trying to bring people together that are coming from very, very different backgrounds, and you want to reduce the chances of your students feeling prejudiced towards each other, first, establish some common goals. Have them working towards a common goal. Give them equal status among the participants. Support the norms for their interaction. Show them how to interact with each other respectfully and how to listen. And give them roles that make them interdependent. Don't give them roles where one person can do all the work. Give them roles where they're required to work with each other to complete a task. So if you can get your students working towards a common goal, needing each other, having equal status, and supporting those interactions, you're going to be able to create a more healthy environment for your learners. Oop, don't know how I went backward. All right. So as you consider your own class, think about how you model respect, openness, and curiosity for your students. How do you build a class environment that engenders these attitudes? How do your assignments, activities, and projects leverage these conditions? Those are just some questions to think about after the session is over and you're thinking about what you'd like to do with your own students. Think about how you can bring them together, how you can get them working toward a common goal, how you can give them equal status, how you can get them to be interdependent. All right. And finally, the last truth is that it's a lifelong process developing intercultural competence. So set realistic expectations for your students. Cultivate reflection after they have an intercultural experience. This is a book, which I mentioned earlier, that is fantastic, especially for higher education. So if you're coming from a higher education background, check this book out. Lots of practical strategies to use in it. You have to prepare students for the messiness of intercultural communication. Maybe do an orientation where you talk about repairing communication, dealing with situations in which they're wrong or they've offended someone or they're embarrassed, because that's gonna happen. Like 100% is going to happen when they communicate across cultures. Nobody wants to offend other people usually. Usually people want to be polite and nice to everyone, but you have to prepare students for that. And also, it's not realistic to expect that students are going to achieve intercultural competence without actually interacting with people from other cultures, right? They have to talk with people from other cultures. They can't do it in a one-day workshop. They can't do it in heavily structured or facilitated exchanges. They can't do it in just one semester, and they're not going to do it without experiencing discomfort or regression. It's going to happen. All right. Where can you get this book? It's definitely on Amazon. If Amazon's available to you. I saw it out there. If you have access to a library, I always go to the library first if your library can get you a copy. All right, let's see. So my quick and dirty list for intercultural competence is be aware of what your cultural lens is, what your expectations and assumptions are. Shut up and listen. That's sometimes very hard to do. Listen and try to understand, try to accept the person however they're presenting themselves. Be curious and ask respectful questions. Accept people as they are and reflect on your intercultural interactions. All right, so there's my contact information again. If you want to grab that Q code, and you can get links to this presentation as well as some other flyer. I think there's a flyer about publishing in TESOL. I'm gonna leave the screen up for just a moment. In a couple minutes, I'll turn off my sharing and I'll come back to my webcam and I'll take some questions if there's anyone who has questions that they'd like to ask before we end this session.